Looking around the general consensus online and the discourse that surrounded this game during its release window revealed a lot of interesting factors to me. The fact that this game was supposedly lesser than its predecessors, that it was one of the least creative and impressive within the long-running Splinter Cell franchise. However, I remember playing this game as a kid and thoroughly enjoying it, so I gave it a go about a month ago, and the game was actually quite fantastic despite the contrived notions placed in my head about the game's quality. We'll dive into the gameplay and the story, and how this game remains underrated in 2023. The gameplay of Splinter Cell Blacklist doesn't seem to stray far from the inception of the series and the general gameplay within the franchise's predecessors, and while that may seem like a good point for the game's quality, it also may seem like a failure in the game's ability to innovate or further refine upon an already hardened formula. But for me, playing through the game ended up being an absolute blast. Since playing this game, I've collected the other games in the franchise, and so I can eventually compare my one-sided notions and perceptions of this game to the franchise's quality overall. This game was extremely enjoyable. I'm not one for stealth games personally. They take much more calculation and slow maneuvering than one with my patience meter has time for, and sometimes stealth games make the player fail if one person is alerted or something goes wrong within that stage. This often makes the advent of stealth for me a drag in most places, which is probably why even when I play stealth oriented games like Metal Gear Solid 5, I find myself taking the fastest route, which usually means taking down everything in a roar of guns blazing. However, and surprisingly, I found myself taking time and calculating the prowess of my next moves in this game, as it was extremely satisfying. And what I appreciated a lot was the fact that an instant breakage of that stealth in most scenarios didn't wield to fail, and that meant I didn't have to constantly redo bits that I already spent way too much time on. So if I accidentally broke out of the prowess of my own calculations, the game would never punish me too much for that, and that made me appreciate to the point where I may even restart to get a better stealth scenario of what I'd just done. There's a lot going on in the gameplay, from the vaulting, the shooting and crawling. There's a lot to unpack. Firstly, you've got the ability to customize your gear, gadgets and weapons before every mission, and this was super fun to mix up and also added greatly to the variety of the gameplay throughout the game. Some missions my setup would have a shotgun and scream out aggressive gameplay, while other times a silent sniper and pistol with an electrifying drone made stealth an absolute blast to go through. Where some missions kind of recommended that I use an SMG or rush to a certain objective due to the stakes presented within the narrative, other times the silence and darkness of the mission setting made it so that stealth was almost certainly the only option, and the best option for the greatest gameplay experience. Shooting feels really nice, and so does utilizing gadgets and melee to go a bit more hands-on when taking down enemies. It takes a lot of calculation and timing to pull off stealth sometimes, but it always ends up being a rewarding and satisfying experience that actually pushes you to do it more. Weapon variety is also great, and mixing between the different weapons throughout the gameplay sections of the game made it much more diverse in what was being presented to me. Also, the vaulting, crawling, and utilizing different advents in accomplishing a task that has a straight path but taking another route will always be fun in any game, and especially here it's fun to find out how everything links and how you can utilize the infrastructure of that particular level to your utmost advantage. However, there are a couple complaints I do have about the gameplay. Either it be the clunkiness of the vaulting mechanics in some certain areas, which make it frustrating to play through, or some guns just not working how they're supposed to sometimes, making it also annoying to fight enemies with. As well as this, the very few forced sections of stealth within the game are also frustrating to go through, and as they often put you into scenarios where they're not very well designed, and so it made those scenarios a little more annoying. However, the gameplay here overall is quite well designed, and certainly the greatest facet the game has to offer, as the story here doesn't really relish any particular greatness in storytelling, and I hope that isn't a continued aspect that I'll see when delving into previous games within this franchise. This section will be kind of short because, to be entirely honest, there's not much to cover here. The story is in almost all areas just to serve as an absolute backdrop for the fantastic and certainly riveting gameplay to continuously take its center stage. And where the gameplay is full of quality and its all-around persistence and greatness, the story here isn't something that can say the same. It's only been a month since I've played the game, and most details that are retained from the game's story components have kind of left my space, and that's entirely due to the fact that it wasn't very memorable or unique in any way. I think maybe maybe that's due to the fact that I'm definitely not connected to these characters in any way, but the general consensus online also makes it seem that this is one of the weakest entries in the series in terms of its story, and without even playing the other games, I can definitely see why. It's another generic counter-terrorist plot, which has constantly been explored in literally every other shooter game out there, from Call of Duty to Battlefield, and Splinter Cell does little to change this around and make it its own. Despite all of the problems with the lack of cohesiveness in the story, its forgettable cast, especially in its villain, the mission design was still quite utterly fantastic. And one other factor that was actually decent in terms of the story component was the mostly human and well thought out conversations between the main cast that will surround you during the game, and they were quite fun to interact with overall. But I think you can see from what I've said so far, I don't recommend this game based on its ability to tell its story, rather the fantastic and riveting gameplay, and in many ways I think that's exactly what the developers here wanted. So despite some negative connotations surrounding the game, I still have to recommend it overall due to its amazing gameplay, and I highly suggest that you give this underrated gem a go even in 2023, as you will have an absolute blast exactly like I did. Anyway, that's all from me for today's video. I'll see you all in the next one. Peace.